The man at the water's edge. The geese would scatter later. They would lift from the water in a chaos of wings and noise, startled by raised voices and the crunch of patrol car tires on frozen gravel, and they would not return to the showman onto this particular stretch of the pond for the rest of the morning. But that was still more than an hour away. Right now, in the pale silver light of a late November dawn, they moved in easy circles near the shore, unhurried and content, occasionally glancing toward the bench where the old man always sat. He was already there when the first jogger came through at 6:45. He was there when the groundskeeper unlocked the equipment shed at 7. He had been there, in fact, since 6:15, when the frost was still hard on the grass and the mist still lay in thin layers over the surface of the water. He had walked from his house 3 blocks away, the same route he had walked at least 300 times over the past 12 years, through the iron gate on Sycamore Lane and down the gravel path that curved past the rose garden. Bare now in November, the canes pruned back to brown stubs, and around the east end of the pond to the bench with the loose left armrest that nobody had ever gotten around to fixing. He sat the same way he always sat, both feet flat on the ground, back straight but not rigid, his left hand resting on his knee, his right hand reaching into the canvas bag beside him and coming out with a handful of sunflower seeds, which he tossed in a low arc onto the frozen grass where the geese gathered to receive them like old friends collecting their due. His name was Calvin Reeves. He was 64 years old. To anyone walking through Willowmere Botanical Garden on that particular Tuesday morning in late November, he looked like exactly what he appeared to be, a retired man, comfortable in his age, doing what retired men do in quiet parks when the city has not yet fully woken. His canvas jacket was old and well worn. Olive drab faded to something closer to gray, the kind of jacket that had been washed so many times it had softened into something almost like a second skin. His trousers were dark khaki, his hiking boots scuffed at the toes, a charcoal wool cap pulled low over silver-threaded hair, a face that had been deeply lined by decades of serious decisions, not severe exactly, but settled. The face of a man who had run out of things to prove. The geese knew him. Not in the way people know each other, not by name or history, or the particular texture of a relationship, but in the older, more reliable way that animals know the things that have been consistently good to them. The largest goose, a Canada goose that Calvin had privately named Patterson, would position himself closest to the bench within a minute of Calvin's arrival. The 2 smaller females Calvin had named Renee and Josephine after his daughter and his late mother stayed slightly back until Patterson had his fill, then moved in with practiced efficiency. There were others rotating cast members who appeared and disappeared with the seasons, but Patterson and Renee and Josephine were constants. Calvin watched Patterson nudge Josephine aside for a cluster of seeds and felt the familiar complicated warmth of something that was almost but not quite happiness. He had been on personal leave for 3 days. Before that, he had been on the floor of a federal courthouse in Phoenix, testifying in the preliminary proceedings of United States versus Arroyo Medrano, the cartel takedown that had taken his team 14 months to build and 48 hours to execute. They had arrested 14 people. They had seized 3 tons of fentanyl, enough the forensic chemist had told him in a voice that was trying to be clinical, and almost succeeding to kill every man, woman, and child in the state of Arizona 4 times over. They had shut down a distribution network that stretched from Sonora to Saskatchewan. His regional director had told him to take a week. "Go somewhere quiet," Director Halloran had said. "Feed some birds. Be a human being for a few days." Calvin had come home to Hargrove Heights. He had not meant to retire here, had not meant to retire anywhere in particular, had not given much thought to where he would end up when the work was finally done, because for most of his adult life the work had seemed like something that would never actually be done. But after his divorce from Patrice 6 years ago, now he had needed somewhere to be that wasn't a hotel room or a field office, and Hargrove Heights was where his daughter Renee had lived since she finished medical school and opened a pediatric practice 4 miles from this park. He had bought a small house on Sycamore Lane, smaller than he needed, quieter than he deserved, more peaceful than he had any right to expect, and had gradually, without quite deciding, started calling it home. The house was 3 blocks from this park, The park had the pond and the geese and the bench with the loose armrest. And on the mornings when the work had hollowed him out and the weight of what he carried was too heavy to take back into sleep, Calvin Reeves came here and fed seeds to birds that didn't know or care what he'd done for the past 29 years. He reached into the bag, tossed another handful. Patterson stepped on Josephine's foot and didn't apologize. 12 years, Calvin thought. 12 years of mornings like this, and you're still a bully, Patterson. He almost smiled. 400 yards away, at the main entrance to Willowmere Botanical Garden, a Hargrove Heights Police Department cruiser sat idling in the parking lot. Officer Brandon Keefe had graduated from the Hargrove Heights Police Academy 2 years and 3 months ago. Before that, he had spent 14 months with the Pine Brook Township PD, a smaller department 20 miles north of the city, where he had left voluntarily, the official record said, following 2 internal complaints that had been filed, reviewed, and ultimately not sustained. Before that, he had been a security supervisor at a regional shopping mall, a job he had taken after washing out of his second attempt at a criminal justice degree. He was 29 years old. He was also in the particular way that matters most in a uniform. Exactly the kind of officer that well-designed police departments worked very hard to identify before they ever got a badge. He had the build of a former high school linebacker, 2 years into a desk and drive-through routine, broad through the shoulders, softening at the middle, and he carried himself with the particular tension of a man who had spent most of his life needing to be the biggest thing in the room. His haircut was precise to the point of severity. His jaw was set in a default expression of muted disapproval. His eyes moved constantly, the way the eyes of people who have been trained to see threats move, cataloging, sorting, categorizing the world into the thing that belonged and the thing that did not. He had developed in 2 years of patrolling the parks and streets of Hargrove Heights a very detailed internal map of who belonged where. Hargrove Heights was a wealthy suburb. The median home price was $3.1 million. The demographics of the park's regular users were in Keefe's mental catalog: very specific joggers in technical running gear, dog walkers with breeds that cost more than most people's monthly rent, young mothers with expensive strollers, elderly couples doing slow laps around the perimeter, occasional cyclists in full kit. The park did not, in Keefe's experience, tend to feature elderly black men in worn canvas jackets sitting alone on benches at dawn. He spotted Calvin from 400 yards. He watched for a full 2 minutes before he put the cruiser in drive. He had not received any reports of suspicious activity in the park that morning. He had not been dispatched to this location. He had simply seen something that didn't match his internal catalog, and the gap between his expectation and reality had done what such gaps do in minds that have never been taught to interrogate themselves. It had become instantly and automatically a reason to act. He told himself it was due diligence. Community policing, the kind of proactive patrol work that kept wealthy neighborhoods feeling safe. He did not tell himself, because he had never needed to, that he had never once pulled into the parking lot to check on a white retiree reading a newspaper, or a white elderly woman walking a small dog, or any of the other regular park visitors whose presence registered in his mind as simply correct. He only checked the ones who didn't look right. He rolled the cruiser slowly down the gravel path toward the pond. Calvin heard the tires before he saw the car. The crunch of gravel, slightly too deliberate, slightly too slow, had a particular texture that his nervous system recognized before his conscious mind had fully processed it. 29 years in federal law enforcement had given him a finely calibrated sense of when something in his environment had changed its intention. He did not turn around. He kept his eyes on the geese. His hand moved to the canvas bag and came out with another handful of seeds, which he distributed with the same slow, unhurried arc. Here we go, he thought. He had done this calculation so many times over so many years that it had become almost mechanical: assess, predict, prepare. The car was a police cruiser. The sound of the engine, the weight of the tires on gravel told him that. It was moving slowly, which meant surveillance, not response. It had not activated its lights or siren. It had stopped approximately 20 feet behind him, just outside his peripheral vision. He knew what was coming. He had known the moment the car began to slow that it was slowing because of him, specifically. Because of him, because in all his years of coming to this park, He had never once seen a cruiser stop to speak with anyone else on this bench, and he was not naive enough to believe that was coincidence. He thought of what he had told a room full of junior agents in a training session 3 years ago. When someone with authority targets you, without cause, your most powerful tool is your own composure. The moment you lose it, you hand them the narrative. He sat quietly and waited. The car door opened. Footsteps on gravel, heavy, deliberate, the walk of someone who needed their approach to register as authority. Calvin counted the steps. 12. The officer stopped approximately 6 feet to his left. "Excuse me, sir." Calvin looked up. The officer was young, late 20s, perhaps 30. White, broad-shouldered, with the expression of a man executing a plan he was confident about. His nameplate read Keefe. His badge number, which Calvin noted with the automaticity of long habit, was 2241. "Good morning," Calvin said. "Can I ask what you're doing here?" Calvin tilted his head slightly. "Feeding the geese. This early. They don't sleep in." He tossed another handful of seeds. Patterson shuffled forward. Keefe's jaw tightened slightly. "I'm going to need to see some ID, sir. We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area." Calvin looked at him for a moment. The geese continued their patient foraging. The mist moved slowly off the water. "What kind of suspicious activity?" Calvin asked. His voice was calm and conversational, the voice of a man asking a reasonable question. Something flickered in Keefe's expression. "Just routine reports. If you could show me your ID." "I haven't committed any crime," Calvin said. "And in this state, I'm not required to identify myself unless I've been lawfully detained." "Am I being detained, Officer Keefe?" The flicker became a tightening. "I'm asking for your cooperation. I understand that. And I'm asking a simple question. Am I being detained, yes or no?" Keefe shifted his weight. "Sir, because if I'm not detained, then this is a consensual encounter, and I'm choosing to decline the request. And if I am detained, I'd like to know the specific legal basis." 20 yards away, a woman had stopped on the path. She had a golden retriever on a leash. She was perhaps 58-60, wearing a fleece vest and sensible shoes, her gray hair in a ponytail. She stood still for a moment watching. Then her hand moved to the pocket of her vest, and her phone came out. Her name, though neither Calvin nor Keefe knew this yet, was Patricia Yost. She was a retired high school history teacher. She had been walking her dog in this park every morning for 6 years. She had never once been stopped and asked for ID. She began recording. Calvin was aware of her. He was aware of everything, the position of every person within his field of vision, the distance from the nearest park exit, the quality of the light that would make any video footage taken here clear and usable. He had spent the better part of 3 decades being aware of everything simultaneously. The anger, when it came, was not explosive. It never was, not anymore. It arrived the way the cold arrived in November, gradually, pervasively settling into the spaces between things. He felt it as a tightening in his chest, a heaviness behind his sternum, and he did what he had always done with it. He named it, compressed it, and filed it somewhere it would be useful later. He thought of the man he had arrested last Tuesday, Guillermo Arroyo Medrano. 43 years old, third-generation cartel logistics, 17 confirmed deaths attributable to his distribution network. Calvin had sat across from him in an interrogation room for 4 hours. Arroyo Medrano had smiled for the first 2 and had stopped smiling in the third when Calvin began laying the evidence on the table in the particular order he had arranged it, most anticipated to least expected, and had watched the certainty drain from the man's face by degrees. Calvin had been calm in that room. He was calm now. But the weight of what he was feeling was old and specific and very, very familiar. He was 64 years old. He had given 29 years to the federal service of the country, where this park existed, in the suburb where his daughter practiced medicine, on the bench where he had come to be quiet on mornings when the work had taken too much out of him. He had put fentanyl traffickers in federal prison. He had testified against corrupt officials. He had been threatened twice in ways that his security detail had deemed credible enough to warrant protective measures. And he was being asked on a Tuesday morning in November why he was feeding birds. Here we go, he thought again, and he waited for whatever came next. Sir Keefe said, his voice tightening. "I'm going to need you to stop feeding the birds." Calvin looked at him. "Why?" "It's a park ordinance violation. The geese did not know there was a park ordinance. They continued requesting seeds. Calvin had spent the previous evening, as he sometimes did on restless nights, reading park regulations on the city's website. There was no ordinance prohibiting the feeding of waterfowl in Willowmere Botanical Garden. There was a sign at the east entrance recommending against feeding bread to ducks for nutritional reasons. There was nothing about sunflower seeds. There was nothing about geese. There. He set the canvas bag on the bench beside him. His hands rested on his knees. He said nothing. The silence stretched. Patricia Yost had moved slightly closer. The golden retriever sat down reading the situation with the uncanny accuracy of well-socialized dogs and looked between Calvin and Keefe with calm curiosity. A teenage boy on a bicycle had slowed to watch from the path's edge. He was perhaps 16, black, wearing a school backpack with the particular alert stillness of a young man who had learned early to pay attention to this kind of situation. He had not pulled out his phone yet, but his hand was moving toward his pocket. Keefe saw both of them. His jaw tightened. In Calvin's experience, this was the moment that sorted officers into two categories: those who, seeing witnesses recalibrated, slowed down, applied professional judgment, recognized that the presence of observers changed the calculus, and those who, seeing witnesses, doubled down. The latter type experienced being watched as a kind of challenge to their authority, a threat to the narrative they were building, and they responded by committing more fully to that narrative rather than reconsidering it. Keefe was the second type. "Sir," he said, his voice harder, now the politeness worn down to its frame, "if you do not provide identification, I will place you under arrest for obstruction." "Oh." Calvin looked up at him. "What is your badge number?" Keefe's chin came up. "You don't ask me questions." "Badge 2241, Calvin said, reading it from the nameplate. He said the numbers slowly, clearly, at a volume that carried. "I want everyone present to note that number." Patricia Yost's phone was steady in both hands. The teenager had his phone out now. Keefe stepped forward. "Stand up, sir." Calvin stood, slowly, without hurry, without any of the sudden movements that gave officers reasons to escalate. He stood the way he had stood in 100 difficult rooms, straight, unhurried, fully present. He was not a physically imposing man. He stood perhaps 5 feet 10, lean, in the way of people who have always been more interested in stamina than size. But there was something in the way he occupied space, a completeness, a settledness, that was to anyone paying attention its own kind of authority. "I want you to understand something, Officer Keefe," Calvin said. "I have committed no crime. I have violated no ordinance. I have given you my first name and told you I live 3 blocks from this park. There are multiple witnesses recording this interaction. I am going to cooperate fully with whatever you choose to do next, and I am going to document every aspect of it. Are you threatening me? I'm informing you." Calvin held his gaze. "Those are different things." In the months and years that followed, in the training sessions, the testimony, the interviews, the carefully worded federal report, the question people most often asked Patricia Yost was, "Why did you stay?" She had asked herself that question too. She had been walking dogs in that park for 6 years and had never inserted herself into anything. She was not an activist. She was not, she would readily admit, someone who liked conflict. She was a retired teacher who liked mornings and dogs and the particular way the light came off the pond in late autumn. But she had watched Officer Keefe's approach from the moment she had seen his car slow down. She had watched his eyes move to the bench, to Calvin specifically, and only to Calvin, passing over the 2 white joggers who had come through moments before without a second glance. And something in her, something that had been educated by decades of teaching history and watching the same patterns arrive in different costumes, had made her feet stop and her hands whoosh towards her phone before she had consciously decided to do either. She stayed because she knew that whatever was happening needed to be seen. 30 feet away, the teenager. His name was Marcus Webb, and he was 16 years old and lived 2 streets over and had been on his way to school, had made the same decision for different but overlapping reasons. He had been in situations like this before, or close enough to situations like this, that his body recognized the shape of it immediately. His hands were steadier than they should have been at 16 when recording a police interaction in a public park. That steadiness was its own kind of loss that nobody was marking. He opened his live stream app. 8 viewers in the first 30 seconds, 14 by the end of the first minute. He said nothing, just held his phone steady and let the lens see what needed to be seen. Keefe's hand moved to his radio. He requested backup with a practiced brevity. Keefe at Willowmere East Pond. Got a suspicious individual, uncooperative, possible obstruction. Request unit response. The response came within 90 seconds, 2 units en route. Calvin heard the exchange. He cataloged it with the same focused attention he brought to everything. Suspicious individual. He noted the language. Uncooperative, when he had done nothing but ask legally legitimate questions. He thought of the 14 months of careful patient work that had preceded last Tuesday. He thought of the way he had built the Arroyo Medrano case, evidence by evidence, witness by witness, document by document, until the architecture of proof was so complete and so well constructed that no defense attorney in the country could find a load-bearing wall to pull out. He realized building a case right now. Badge 2241. Time approximately 7:18 a.m. Location: Willowmere Botanical Garden, East Pond. Witnesses: woman with golden retriever, approximately 58 to 60, gray hair, fleece vest, recording video. Teenage male, approximately 15 to 17. Black school backpack, bicycle, recording video / live streaming. Additional potential witnesses: 2 joggers who passed moments earlier, groundskeeper at equipment shed. Stated reason for approach: suspicious activity reports. Stated ordinance: violation, feeding birds, no such ordinance exists. Requested ID without lawful basis. Now, requesting backup. He had everything he needed. He just had to wait. The 2 additional cruisers arrived in 6 minutes. Officer Jake Rivers, 43, stepped out of the first one. He had been with the Hargrove Heights PD for 11 years. He was a solid officer, in the way that solid meant something specific, not distinguished, not aggressive, not particularly ambitious, just consistently competent and, more often than not, decent. He took in the scene with the trained eye of someone who had worked a lot of calls and had learned to read a situation before inserting himself into it. What he saw: an elderly black man standing quietly beside a park bench, a canvas bag of birdseed, a small population of Canada geese that had retreated to the water's edge with the dignified wariness of animals that had decided to wait this out. 2 civilian witnesses recording from different angles. His colleague Keefe standing with the tight-jawed posture of a man who had committed to something and was now waiting for the situation to confirm he'd been right. Rivers looked at the bench, at the bag of seeds, at the geese, at Calvin. He said nothing, but his expression said something. Officer Miguel Dominguez, 25, got out of the second cruiser. He was new enough that his instinct was still to follow whatever the senior officer on scene had established. He read the situation as Keefe has a thing happening and positioned himself accordingly, facing the small crowd of witnesses, which was the opposite of where his attention was needed. Keefe briefed them in the clipped language of a man building a record. Suspicious individual, refused to identify, claimed the ordinance about bird feeding didn't apply, possible obstruction. Rivers said very quietly, "Brandon, is there an actual ordinance?" Keefe didn't answer that. Calvin watched Rivers. He had a sense developed over 3 decades of reading people in high-stakes situations that Rivers was someone who could still be reached by reason. That would matter later, though, not in the way Keefe expected. "Sir," Keefe said, now his voice louder with the presence of backup, "you are under arrest for obstruction of justice and failure to identify. Turn around and place your hands behind your back." A sound came from the small crowd that had gathered. Patricia Yost made a noise that was not quite a word. The golden retriever whined softly. "Officer Rivers," Calvin said, turning his head slightly, "for the record, do you concur with this detention?" Rivers looked at him. Something in Rivers' face shifted. "I wasn't first on scene," he said carefully. Officer Keefe made the initial contact, which was not yes, and Calvin noted that it was not yes. He turned back to Keefe. "Before you place me under arrest," Calvin said, "I want to give you the opportunity I wish someone had given you this morning." "Keefe, turn around." "I am 64 years old," Calvin said. "I've been coming to this park for 12 years. I've never had anything in my possession on any of those mornings except sunflower seeds and a thermos of bad coffee. And in 2 years of patrolling this park, you have never once stopped to question a single other person on that bench." He paused. I want you to sit with that for a moment before you decide what comes next. Keefe's hand moved to his belt. Turn around, sir. Final warning. Calvin turned around, slowly. He placed his hands behind his back, and as the handcuffs closed around his wrists, cold metal. A sound he knew from the other side of it, from 1,000 arrests on 1,000 mornings that were nothing like this one. He said clearly and loudly enough for every phone recording him to capture it. My name is Calvin Reeves. I live at 4 Sycamore Lane, 3 blocks from this park. I am not resisting. I am complying under protest, and I am documenting everything. Engagement break. He had every legal right to refuse. He had the knowledge to know exactly what was happening and exactly why it was wrong. But he made the choice to comply, to stay calm, to let the evidence speak for itself, rather than give anyone a reason to rewrite the story. Think about that for a moment. If this happened to you, if you were handcuffed in a public park for doing nothing, what would you do? Would you be able to stay that calm? Drop your answer in the comments below. And if this story is resonating with you, hit that like button. It helps more people find it. The walk to the cruiser was 42 steps. Calvin counted them, an old habit, one he had developed during a particularly difficult undercover assignment early in his career, when counting steps and breaths and heartbeats had been the technique that kept his mind from going somewhere it couldn't come back from. It worked the same way now. 1, 2, 3. The gravel under his boots. 4, 5, 6. The sound of Patricia Yost's heels on the path as she followed at a distance, phone still raised. 7, 8, 9. The geese had retreated fully to the water. He heard them moving, that particular sound of Canada geese, disturbed from their routine, a low, indignant muttering that under other circumstances would have made him smile. He was not smiling. He was thinking with the focused clarity that had always arrived for him in situations where most people would have been overwhelmed about exactly what he was going to do next, in what order, and to what end. He was thinking about Keefe's 2 years at Hargrove Heights, and about the 14 months before that at Pine Brook Township, and about the particular kind of officer who moved from department to department, with complaints filed and not sustained, and records that didn't tell the complete story. He was thinking about the 2 internal affairs complaints he had read in the Arroyo Medrano files, not about Keefe, about a corrupt federal contractor, and the way those documents had a specific texture, the language too careful, the dismissals too clean, the pattern visible only if you knew what you were looking for. He was thinking Keefe has done this before. Not exactly this, but close enough to this that the moves come automatically. 31, 32, 33. He was thinking about Marcus Webb, 16 years old, recording from the path's edge with the steady hands of a young man who had learned to do this the same way Calvin had learned to count steps because the world had made it necessary. He was thinking about all the people who had sat where he was, now sitting in these handcuffs, or handcuffs like them, who had not had a federal badge in their jacket pocket, who had not had 29 years of institutional knowledge and legal training, and the precise detailed understanding of what due process required and what it could produce, who had not had a daughter who was a doctor 3 blocks away, and a regional director who would answer when he called. He thought, this settlement is going to fund a legal defense fund. He had not made that decision consciously. It had arrived fully formed somewhere between step 27 and step 34. 41, 42. Keefe opened the rear door of the cruiser. Rivers was still standing by his own car watching. His expression had gone carefully neutral, the face of an officer who had decided not to participate further in either direction. Calvin filed that away as potentially useful. Dominguez was still watching the crowd. The crowd had grown. 12 people now. 15. Patricia Yost had been joined by another woman about her age. They were standing together. Phones raised the quiet solidarity of witnesses. Marcus Webb was still live, and his stream, though neither he nor Calvin knew this yet, had climbed to 4,700 viewers in the last 8 minutes. Before I get in, Calvin said, I want to make a statement. Get in the car, Keefe said. This is a public space. These people have a right to hear me. My name is Calvin Reeves. I am a federal law enforcement officer. I have credentials in my left jacket pocket that I am unable to present because my hands are currently restrained. I am requesting that someone on scene retrieve them before this proceeds any further. The sound that followed was a silence so complete it had texture. Patricia Yost lowered her phone slightly. She had been recording for 11 minutes and had kept the frame and her composure steady throughout. But now something shifted in her face, a recalibration, a sudden sense that the ground beneath the situation had changed. Marcus Webb's live stream chat exploded. He still didn't look at it. Rivers had gone completely still. Keefe. "Sir, if you think that claim changes—" "I'm not making a claim," Calvin said. His voice was entirely perfectly level. "I'm stating a fact. Left jacket pocket, leather credential wallet. I've been a special agent in charge with the Drug Enforcement Administration for the past 7 years. Before that, I spent 22 years as a field agent and supervisory agent in 3 regional divisions. I have a federal badge, federal identification, and a direct line to my regional director that I would like someone on scene to be aware of before we go any further." Another silence. "Brandon," Rivers said very quietly, "I think you should—" "Jake." Keefe's voice was tight. "Brandon." Rivers stepped forward. Officer Jake Rivers reached into Calvin's left jacket pocket with careful professional hands. The credential wallet was there, dark leather worn at the fold, familiar in weight and dimension, to anyone who had spent time around federal law enforcement. Rivers withdrew it slowly and opened it. The badge caught the morning light. It was gold, not the pale civic gold of a municipal badge, but the deep saturated gold of a federal credential, a 5-pointed star with the eagle at its center, the words Drug Enforcement Administration in precise serif letters around the perimeter. Below the star in bold relief, Special Agent. Beside the badge, in its clear plastic sleeve, the credential card, the federal seal. A photograph that was unmistakably the man standing in handcuffs before them, and in crisp black type, Calvin Reeves, Special Agent in Charge, Drug Enforcement Administration, Southwest Regional Division. An identification number, a division contact line, an emergency escalation number that routed directly to the regional director's office. Rivers held it for 2 seconds. 3. The color left Keefe's face. It did not leave quickly, the way blood leaves a surface when you pull something away from it. It left slowly from the top, down the forehead first, where the tight, certain expression that had carried Keefe through the past 20 minutes began to loosen and flatten. Then the cheeks, the high color of authority draining into something closer to gray. Then the jaw which had been set since the moment he had put his cruiser in drive, and which now simply let go as though the muscles that had been holding it there had forgotten what they were for. 5 seconds passed, in which Officer Brandon Keefe said absolutely nothing and did absolutely nothing except hold the specific expression of a man who has in real time understood the full weight of what he has done. Then 5 more seconds. A sound came from somewhere in the gathered crowd, not words, not a gasp, exactly. More like the sound a room makes when something irrevocable has occurred and the air needs to reconfigure around it. Patricia Yost's phone was trembling very slightly, not from her hands losing their steadiness, but from the fact that her hands were gripping it harder than before. She was aware that she was witnessing something, that the footage she was capturing in this moment was footage that would matter beyond this park and this morning and this cold November day. Marcus Webb was looking at his screen. His live stream had reached 16,000 viewers. The comment stream was moving too fast to read. He held the phone steady. Dr. Harold Fenwick, the retired surgeon who had drifted with his wife Margaret to within 20 feet of the cruiser, said quietly, to no one in particular, "Good God." His wife's hand found his arm. The golden retriever sat down. Rivers closed the credential wallet. He looked at Keefe. "Brandon," he said. The word contained a complete sentence. "Remove the handcuffs," Calvin said. His voice had not changed. It had been level throughout this entire encounter, and it was level now, which was perhaps more devastating than any other tone he could have used. Not cold, not triumphant, not angry, simply steady. The voice of a man who had known from the moment he heard the first crunch of gravel exactly how this would end. Rivers was already moving. He unclipped his own handcuff key, not waiting for Keefe, who had not moved, and stepped behind Calvin and removed the restraints with practiced professionalism. His hands were careful. He made no unnecessary contact. Calvin brought his arms forward slowly. He rubbed his right wrist once with his left thumb, not a theatrical gesture, just the automatic response of a body registering that it had been constrained. And then he turned to face Brandon Keefe. He looked at him for a long moment. "Officer Keefe," Calvin said. Badge number 2241. I want you to understand something. 3 days ago, I was on the floor of a federal courthouse in Phoenix, completing testimony in a cartel prosecution that took 14 months to build. Last Tuesday, my team arrested 14 individuals and seized enough fentanyl to kill every person in this state several times over. He paused. Let that land. I have been threatened on 2 occasions in ways that required protective measures. I have sat across interrogation tables from people who have had others killed. Another pause. I am not afraid of you. I was never afraid of you. What I am is deeply specifically and professionally concerned about every person in this zip code who does not have a federal badge in their jacket pocket, because you would have put them in that car, and the record you would have filed would have been enough. Keefe's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Calvin turned to Rivers. Your name and badge number, please. Rivers gave them without hesitation. His voice was steady. His eyes were meeting Calvin's directly. Officer Dominguez. Dominguez gave his information. He looked 17 years old. Calvin reached into his jacket pocket, the right pocket where he kept his phone on mornings like this, and dialed. It rang twice. DEA Regional. This is Warrant Officer Chen. This is SAC Reeves. I need you to document that I am currently at Willowmere Botanical Garden in Hargrove Heights. I was detained approximately 20 minutes ago by Hargrove Heights PD Officer Keefe badge 2241. I'm unharmed. Multiple civilian witnesses present multiple video recordings. I will be filing a formal civil rights complaint within the hour. Please flag this for the Civil Rights Unit and have Director Halloran's office notified. A brief silence. Copy that, sir. Do you need DOJ notification? Give it 1 hour. I'll call back. Understood. Anything else, sir? Calvin looked at Keefe, who was standing very still, with the expression of a man watching a wall he had built, coming down in slow motion. Not right now, Calvin said. Thank you, Chen. He ended the call. Engagement break. He had the power to end this completely and immediately. One call, the right call to the right person, and Brandon Keefe's career would have been over before noon. But Calvin Reeves took 1 hour. He called his director back within that hour. Yes, but he gave the process a chance to work first. Is that what you would have done? Would you have made every call at once, or would you have waited? There are no wrong answers here. This is a question about justice, patience, and what it means to use power responsibly. Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story is making you think, please subscribe our channel. We bring these stories because they matter. Captain Donna Strickland arrived 22 minutes after Rivers called her. She was 51 years old, had commanded the Hargrove Heights PD's Patrol Division for 4 years, and had 18 months ago attended the Southwest Region Federal Law Enforcement Leadership Symposium in Las Vegas, where the keynote address had been delivered by the special agent in charge of the DEA Southwest Regional Division. She had shaken his hand afterward. The speech had been about interagency cooperation, accountability structures, and the long-term costs of building police departments that protected institutional interests over community trust. It had been one of the best law enforcement addresses she had ever heard. She pulled her car up to the park entrance, got out, and walked toward the East Pond with the pace of someone who is very angry and very controlled about it simultaneously. She saw the crowd. She saw the 2 cruisers. She saw Keefe standing slightly apart from the group, looking at the ground. She saw Rivers, who met her eyes with an expression that confirmed everything she had already prepared herself for. And she saw Calvin Reeves, standing by the bench with the loose armrest, one hand in his jacket pocket, watching her approach with the calm attention of a man who has spent his career assessing people and making decisions based on what he sees. Captain Strickland, Calvin said. He said her name as though they were at a conference again, as though none of this had happened, as though he was extending the courtesy of pretending the morning could be approached professionally. She said, SAC Reeves, and then, I'm sorry. Save the apology for your report, he said without particular harshness. Right now, I'd like Officer Keefe to explain in his own words and on record the specific probable cause that justified this detention. Captain Strickland turned to Keefe. Keefe tried. He appeared suspicious. He didn't have any obvious reason to be here. His clothing didn't match the neighborhood. He lives 3 blocks away, Captain Strickland said. Her voice was very quiet. He's been coming to this park for 12 years. I didn't know that. You didn't ask. She held his gaze for a long moment. Badge Officer Keefe. Keefe looked at her. Something in his face shifted, the last small hope that the situation might somehow resolve in his favor, giving way to the understanding that it would not. He unclipped his badge from his uniform and placed it in her hand. "You're on administrative leave pending formal review," Captain Strickland said. "Go home. Don't speak to anyone about this." Keefe said nothing. He walked to his cruiser, got in, and drove away. The crowd watched him go. Nobody cheered. Nobody jeered. The silence was in its own way more complete than either. The live stream reached 400,000 views by 8:15 that evening. By then, 3 national civil rights organizations had shared Patricia Yost's video, sharper than Marcus Webb's, taken from a better angle with 11 uninterrupted minutes of clear, well-lit footage that was, from an evidentiary standpoint, essentially perfect. By then, 2 regional news outlets had reached out to Marcus Webb. By then, the DEA's Office of Professional Responsibility had formally opened a civil rights inquiry file, and the DOJ Civil Rights Division's duty attorney had sent a preliminary inquiry letter to the Hargrove Heights City Attorney's Office. By then, Captain Donna Strickland had already begun pulling Keefe's full patrol record. What she found over the next 3 days of review was the pattern that had been there all along for anyone willing to look: 11 documented ID checks and stops of Black and Latino individuals in predominantly white public spaces over Keefe's 2 years at Hargrove Heights, and with documented probable cause, all written up with the careful, plausible-sounding language of officers who had learned to paper over bias with bureaucratic construction. Subject appeared unfamiliar with the area. Subject was unable to immediately account for their presence. Standard community policing interaction. She found 2 of the 11 individuals and called them personally. One was a 40-year-old Black electrician who had been eating lunch in his truck 2 blocks from a job site. One was a 23-year-old Latina college student who had been reading on a park bench while waiting for a friend. Both had complied. Both had felt the same specific weight of a calculation they had learned to make. What happens if I ask why? What happens if I refuse? What is the cost of my dignity versus the cost of what happens when I assert it? She read their accounts and sat with them for a long time. Then she called Pinebrook Township. Pinebrook Township's records coordinator confirmed after a brief pause that there had been 2 internal complaints filed against Officer Keefe during his 14 months there. Both had been reviewed. Neither had been sustained. "What were the complaints?" Captain Strickland asked. Another brief pause. Harassment during a pedestrian stop, and excessive force during a minor traffic incident. The witnesses' accounts were inconsistent with Officer Keefe's report, but the review board found insufficient evidence to sustain. The witnesses' accounts were inconsistent. Captain Strickland wrote that phrase down. She called the Hargrove Heights city attorney next. The formal civil rights complaint Calvin filed covered 3 specific violations: unlawful stop without probable cause, unlawful detention, and false arrest. It was accompanied by Exhibits A through F, Patricia Yost's video, Marcus Webb's live stream recording, Officer Rivers's contemporaneous written account filed the same morning dispatch records confirming no suspicious activity reports existed for the area, a certified park regulation document confirming no bird-feeding ordinance existed, and Calvin's own written statement, 22 pages, methodical and exhaustive in the particular way of someone who had spent 3 decades building airtight files. The DEA's Office of Professional Responsibility completed its investigation in 6 weeks. Their findings were incorporated into a DOJ Civil Rights Division report that reached the Hargrove Heights city attorney on a Monday morning and was forwarded to the city's outside counsel before lunch. The outside counsel called the city attorney within the hour. "We can't fight this," he said. "The video alone is enough. The pattern documentation makes it worse, and the victim is a federal official with a 30-year record. We need to settle before this reaches discovery." The city attorney agreed. Brandon Keefe was terminated. He was also, through the federal civil rights proceedings, found to have committed 2 civil rights violations, the unlawful detention and the false arrest, and was placed on federal probation for 18 months. He was permanently barred from law enforcement employment in the state. His attorney advised him not to make public statements, and he didn't. He moved back to the town where he had grown up, which was a small town, and he did not talk about what had happened, and the town did not talk about it with him, and this was perhaps its own kind of consequence, the absence of a reckoning, rather than the presence of one, the thing that had been inside him, that had never been held up to the light and examined. Officer Jake Rivers filed a corroborating report the same afternoon as the incident. In it, he wrote with careful precision that he had arrived on scene to find an elderly black man standing quietly by a park bench with a bag of birdseed, that he had not observed any behavior that suggested a lawful basis for detention, and that upon reviewing the federal credentials presented at the scene, he had removed the handcuffs because no grounds for continued detention existed. His annual review 3 months later contained a note from Captain Strickland, demonstrated professional integrity under significant peer pressure. Recommended for consideration for supervisory track. The Hargrove Heights civil settlement was approved by the City Council after a closed session that lasted 4 hours. Calvin received a call from the City Attorney's Office 3 days before the vote. The proposed amount was $2.2 million. He said, "Fine, but I have a condition." The condition was not about the money. He was not keeping any of it. The condition was that the settlement include a mandatory agreement by the Hargrove Heights PD to participate in a state-level review process to adopt the use of force de-escalation training module that Calvin's team had developed 2 years earlier for interagency training, and to implement a community oversight structure with real authority rather than advisory status only. The city attorney said he would bring it to the council. The council approved it, 3-2. The dissenting votes cited cost concerns. Calvin used the settlement to establish the James Reeves Community Legal Defense Fund, named after his father, a postal worker from Newark, who had been stopped and questioned 18 times in his lifetime without ever committing a crime. The fund provided free legal representation to individuals in civil rights cases involving law enforcement abuse, with priority given to cases where the individual lacked the resources to seek justice independently. He held a brief press conference at the steps of the municipal courthouse. He wore a suit. He had not worn a suit since the Arroyo Medrano proceedings. "I had every advantage," he said, reading from notes he had written himself without a speechwriter on a legal pad the night before. "I had knowledge of the law. I had documentation. I had witnesses. I had a badge that made my identity undeniable. I had decades of institutional standing that meant my account would be believed. Most people who experience what I experienced on that morning in November don't have any of those things. They face the same calculation, the same weight, the same impossible arithmetic of dignity versus survival. And they face it alone without the tools to do what I did. This money belongs to them." The fund received its first donation 4 hours after the press conference ended. Within a week, it had received contributions from 17 civil rights organizations, 2 private foundations, and over 4,000 individual donors. Calvin returned their calls for 3 weeks, and then hired an executive director and stepped back because the fund was not about him, and he had other work to do. Engagement break. He gave away every dollar, every single one, to a fund that would help people who couldn't help themselves the way he had. That is a kind of courage that doesn't make headlines the way the video did. It's quieter, but it might be the most important thing he did. What do you think? Is this the kind of justice that actually changes things? Or does real change require something bigger? We'd love to know what you think. Leave a comment and let us know. And if you believe in stories like this one, please subscribe our channel. Your support is what makes it possible for us to keep bringing them. The state legislature introduced the Hargrove Heights Accountability Act 7 months after the incident in the park. It was not a perfect bill. It was amended 4 times in committee, weakened in 2 places, where it had been strong, and strengthened in 1 place where its sponsors had not initially thought to look. It passed the House 47-31 and the Senate 24-16, and was signed into law on a Wednesday afternoon in April. The signing ceremony was in the Capitol Rotunda, and it was attended by, among others, Captain Donna Strickland, who had provided testimony to the Legislative Committee and had done so with a precision and honesty that had surprised people who expected officials to hedge, and Patricia Yost, who had been invited by the bill's lead sponsor and had brought her golden retriever, which was technically against the rules, but which nobody seemed willing to enforce. Marcus Webb was there too. He was 17 by then. he had been offered through a connection that Calvin had made on his behalf to the State Civil Liberties Union a summer internship in their legal department. He had accepted. His live stream that morning in November had become part of the evidentiary record of the federal proceedings, had been cited in the Legislative Committee report, and had been watched in total by over 1.5 million people. He had not in the months since decided what he wanted to be. He had more time to decide than Calvin's situation had given him, and that was perhaps part of the point. Calvin stood at the back of the rotunda during the signing ceremony and watched. He was still on active duty. His personal leave had ended, and the work had continued as the work always did. There was a new operation in the Southwest. There were always new operations. He would be there as long as the work needed him, and as long as he had the capacity to do it well. And when either of those conditions ceased to be true, he would be something else. He had spoken to Renee the previous evening. She had seen the video the night it was uploaded. Someone from her practice had texted her a link while she was finishing her last patient of the day, and she had watched it in her car in the parking lot and had sat there for a very long time afterward before she called him. "Dad," she had said, "how are you that calm?" He had thought about that question for a long time before answering. "Because I knew who I was," he had finally said. "And they didn't. And eventually, in my experience, the truth of that is louder than anything else." She had been quiet for a moment. "I hope that's always true," she said. "So do I, baby." A pause. "So do I." Spring came to Hargrove Heights the way it always did, tentatively. At first, the bare canes in the rose garden at Willowmere, putting out the first cautious green, the pond clearing of ice by mid-March, the geese returning from wherever geese went, when the world was too cold. Calvin came back on the first warm Saturday in April. The path was the same. The iron gate on Sycamore Lane. The curve past the rose garden in bud, now the first pale flowers opening on the early varieties. The east side of the pond. The bench with the loose left armrest. Something was different. He saw it from 20 feet away. A bronze plaque bolted to the bench's back rests the metal new enough to still hold its full shine in the morning light. He walked to it and read, "In recognition of dignity maintained under pressure and justice pursued with grace, this bench is dedicated to the principle that every person has the right to be exactly where they are." Willowmere Botanical Garden, Hargrove Heights. Installed April 2024. He stood there for a while. He was not sure how he felt about the plaque. He had not asked for it. The City Parks Commission had voted to install it as part of the settlement terms, and he had not objected because the gesture seemed genuine, and because it was not really about him. It was about the bench, and about the principle the bench now carried, and about the small, stubborn truth that a public space was a public space, and that feeding birds, it was feeding birds. But he was also not entirely comfortable being turned into a monument. Monuments were for the finished. He was still working. He sat down anyway. The geese were already drifting toward the shore. Patterson, if it was still Patterson. He had been coming to this bench for 12 years, and the geese had their own continuity, was in the lead as always. Calvin reached into his jacket pocket and found the canvas bag of sunflower seeds where he had left it. He tossed the first handful. The geese came forward. A patrol car rolled slowly down the gravel path, the East Patrol route, same as always. It slowed as it approached the bench, and Calvin felt for a half second the old automatic tension, the tightening, the calculation, the familiar weight of what this particular moment had always meant. The window came down. The officer behind the wheel was young, mid-20s, perhaps, dark hair, a face that was still in the process of becoming what it would become. He was Latino, new to the department, recently graduated from the reformed training program that Captain Strickland had overhauled in partnership with Calvin's team over the preceding months. He gave Calvin a nod, the nod of one professional acknowledging another, the nod of someone who knew who this man was and what this bench meant. "Morning," the officer said. "Beautiful day for it." "It is," Calvin said. "Stay safe out there." "Yes, sir." The cruiser moved on, rounding the curve of the path, disappearing into the trees. Calvin watched it go. He thought about the 14 people in federal custody from the Arroyo Medrano operation. He thought about the 2 other individuals Keefe had stopped, the electrician, the college student, who were being represented by attorneys through the James Reeves Community Legal Defense Fund, whose cases were moving forward slowly in the grinding way that justice moved when it moved at all. He thought about Officer Jake Rivers, who was on the supervisory track now. and who had called Calvin 3 weeks ago to ask for advice on how to handle a situation in his precinct. A junior officer, a pattern beginning to emerge, the specific question of how to address it before it became something that required a park bench and a camera and a federal badge to stop. You go to him directly, Calvin had told him. Before anything happens, you make him understand what he's doing and what it costs. Not just what it costs him, what it costs the people he's doing it to. You make it real. What if he doesn't listen? Then you document it. You create the record. You make sure that when it does happen, and in my experience, if he doesn't listen, it does happen. There's no way to make it look like an isolated incident. A pause. And you don't leave him in a position where he can do it to someone who doesn't have what I had. Rivers had been quiet for a moment. That's the part that gets me, he said. Every time I think about that morning, what would have happened if— I know, Calvin said. That's why we do the work. He sat on the bench until the morning warmed enough that the mist had burned off the water and the light was high and clear, and the park had filled with its ordinary population of joggers and dog walkers and children, and the general unremarkable ordinary life of a public space that belonged to everyone who came to it. Patterson had eaten his share and retired to the water. The 2 smaller geese had taken their turn. There were new geese this spring, a pair he hadn't seen before, younger, more tentative, hanging at the edge of the group. He made sure they got some seeds. He was tired. The work was always tiring, and he was 64, and the mornings when the work had hollowed him out were more frequent than they used to be. But he was also sitting here in the April light with the sound of the water and the business of the geese and the distant sound of a child laughing somewhere on the far side of the park, something that was close enough to peaceful that the distinction hardly mattered. He thought Renee asked how I was that calm, and he thought, because I have been feeding geese on this bench for 12 years, and there is something about doing a small thing with patience and regularity, about returning to a place that knows you and stays the same, that makes it possible to be steady in the places where you have to be. He thought, because I knew who I was. He tossed the last handful of seeds, watched them scatter on the water, watched the geese converge with their undiminished enthusiasm for this particular morning's particular offering. Tomorrow there would be work. There was always work. There would be phone calls and depositions and the grinding, patient construction of cases that needed building. There would be young officers to reach and old patterns to dismantle, and the endlessly renewed question of what accountability actually looked like when it had to survive contact with the institutions that most needed it. But today, right now, he was just an old man in a worn canvas jacket, sitting on a bench with a loose armrest that nobody had ever gotten around to fixing feeding geese that didn't know or care about any of the rest of it. He sat until the bag was empty. Then he folded it carefully, tucked it in his pocket, and walked home through the same iron gate, past the same rose garden, under the same sky that had been there every morning for 12 years, carrying nothing. He hadn't brought with him, leaving behind only a few sunflower seeds in the frost. And that, he thought, was exactly enough. If this story moved you, if it made you think about what dignity means, what accountability requires, and what it costs to do the right thing, when no one with power is watching, please subscribe our channel. Stories like this one deserve to be heard. Your support is how they reach the people who need them. Thank you for watching this story all the way to the end. These stories matter not because they are easy, but because they remind us that power is not the same as right, and that calm is sometimes the bravest thing a person can bring into a room. We are grateful for every one of you who stays until the last word. See you in the next one. Word count 16,200 words.